"Must we go into the house to write?" asked Clara, who was willing to send a report to her grandmamma, but she wanted to spend the time outdoors. She did not want to go in. Heidi knew how to manage. In a twinkling she ran into the hut and came back laden with all her school materials and a three-legged stool. She laid her reader and writing book in Clara's lap so that she could write on them, and seated herself on the little stool by the bench. And then they began to tell the grandmamma what had happened. But after every sentence she wrote, Clara had to lay her pencil down and look around her. It was quite too lovely. The wind was no longer cool as it had been. It hovered around their faces, gently fanning them, and whispered softly up in the fir trees. Merry little insects danced and hummed in the clean air, and a great stillness lay over all the sunny landscape. The lofty, rocky peaks looked down big and still, and the whole wide valley below lay wrapped in quiet peacefulness. Only now and then the merry shouts of some shepherd boy sounded through the air, and the echo gave back the tones softly from the cliffs. The morning passed, the children knew not how, and the grandfather came with the steaming bowls, for he said they must stay outdoors with the little daughter as long as there was a ray of light in the sky. So the dinner, as on the previous day, was placed before the hut and was eaten with enjoyment. Then Heidi rolled Clara in her chair out under the fir trees, for the children had decided that they would spend the afternoon sitting in the lovely shade and telling each other what had happened since Heidi left Frankfurt. Although everything had gone on in the usual way, still Clara had all sorts of things to tell about the people who Heidi knew very well in the Sesamon house. So the children sat together under the old fir trees, and the more eagerly they talked, the louder whistled the birds up in the branches, for the chatting below pleased them, and they were anxious to take part in it. Thus the time passed, and before they knew it, evening had come, and the army of goats came rushing down, their leader behind them, with wrinkled brow and with anger in his manner. "Good night, Peter," Heidi called to him when she saw they had no idea of stopping. "Good night, Peter," called out Clara pleasantly. He gave no reply, and angrily snorting drove the goats ahead of him. When Clara saw the grandfather lead pretty Schwanley to the stall to be milked, she was all at once seized with such a longing for the spicy milk that she could hardly wait until he came out with it. She was surprised at herself. "It's very strange, Heidi," she said. "As long as I can remember, I've eaten only because I had to, and everything I took tasted like cod-liver oil. And I have thought 1,000 times, if only I never had to eat. And now I can hardly wait until your grandfather comes with the milk." "Yes, I know what that is," replied Heidi, quite understandingly, for she thought of the day in Frankfurt when everything stuck in her throat and would not go down. But Clara could not see how it was. In all her life long she had never eaten outdoors in the fresh air as she had done today, and never in this high, bracing mountain air. When the grandfather came with his little bowls, Clara seized her quickly, thanking him for it, and drank it eagerly, and this time finished before Heidi. "May I have a little more?" she asked, holding out her bowl to the grandfather. He nodded, much pleased, took Heidi's bowl also, and went back to the hut. When he came out again, he brought with each bowl a cover made of a different material from what covers are usually made of. In the afternoon the grandfather had taken a walk to the green Mayenses, to the cow-keeper's hut, where they made sweet, bright yellow butter. He had brought home from there a lovely round ball. Now he had taken 2 nice slices of bread and spread them thick with the sweet butter. These the children were going to have for their supper. Both immediately took such deep bites of the appetizing slices that the grandfather stood still to see them continue, for it pleased them. Later, when from her bed Clara was again gazing at the sparkling stars, she followed Heidi's example. Her eyes closed immediately, and such a sound, healthful sleep came over her as she had never known before. The following day passed in the same delightful way as also the next, and then came a great surprise for the children. 2 strong porters came climbing up the mountain, each one carrying on his back a high bed, all arranged in the bedstead, both covered exactly alike, with a white coverlet, clean and brand new. The men also brought a letter from the grandmamma. It said that these beds were for Clara and Heidi, that the hay beds were to be taken away, and that from this time on Heidi must sleep in a regular bed. In the winter, one of them must be sent down to Derfley, but the other was to remain up there so that Clara would always find it if she came back. And then the grandmamma praised the children on account of their long letters and urged them to continue writing every day, so that she might always know everything about them as if she were with them. Then the grandfather went into the hut, threw the contents of Heidi's bed on the big heap of hay, and laid away the covers. Then he came back to help the men carry the 2 beds up into the loft. He pushed them close together so that the view through the window might be the same from both pillows, for he knew what delight the children took in the morning and evening light as it came in there. Meanwhile, the grandmamma stayed down in Ragaz and was highly delighted with the excellent reports which reached her every day from the Clara became more and more charmed with her new life, and could not say enough about the grandfather's kindness and thoughtful care of her, and how merry and amusing Heidi was, much more so than in Frankfurt, and how every morning her first thought when she awoke was, "Oh, praise the Lord, I'm still on the arm." This remarkably delightful news was a fresh joy to the grandmamma every day. She found also that as things were she could put off her visit to the a little longer, for which she was not sorry, since the ride up the steep mountain and down again was rather difficult for her. The grandfather must have felt a particular and remarkable interest in his little charge, for not a day passed when he did not think of something new to strengthen her. Every afternoon now he took a walk up among the rocks, and higher, and every time he brought back a little bundle which scented the air for long distance like spicy pinks and thyme, and attracted the goats at evening, so that they all began to bleat and leap and try to push all together into the shed where the plants lay, for they knew the odor well. But the uncle had made the door fast, because he had not climbed up high on the rocks after the rare plants, that the whole crowd of goats might get a good meal without any trouble. The herbs were all intended for Schwanli, that she might give still richer milk. It was plain to see how this unusual care affected her, for she tossed her head in the air more and more vigorously, and, besides, her eyes flashed fire. It was now the 3rd week since Clara had come up on the mountain. For several days, when the grandfather had brought her down in the morning to place her in her chair, he had said to her, "Will the little daughter not try just once to stand on the ground a moment?" Clara had tried to do as he wished, but had always said immediately, "Oh, it hurts me so," and had clung fast to him, but each day he had let her try a little longer. Such a beautiful summer had not been seen on the Arm for many, many years. Every day the beaming sun shone in a cloudless sky, and all the little flowers opened their cups wide and gleamed and sent their fragrance up to it, and at evening it threw its purple and rosy light over the rocky peaks and across the snowfields, and then disappeared in a blazing sea of gold. Heidi told her friend Clara about it all again and again, for it could only be seen properly up in the pasture, and she was especially enthusiastic about the place up on the slope, where there were great quantities of shining golden wild roses, and so many bluebells that one would think the grass was blue, and close by great bushes full of little brown flowers, which smelled so lovely that one has to sit down on the ground among them and never wants to leave them. Sitting under the fir trees, Heidi just had to tell again and again about the flowers up there, and the sunset and the fiery rocks, and then such a longing seized her to go up there again that suddenly she jumped up and ran to her grandfather, who was sitting in his shop carving. "Oh, grandfather," she called out before she was at all near him. "Oh, grandfather, will you go up with us to the pasture tomorrow? It is so lovely up there now." "I will agree to it," said the grandfather in assent, "but the little daughter must also do me a favor. She must try hard again this evening to stand." Heidi came back shouting for joy with her news to Clara, and Clara promised to try to stand on her feet as many times as the grandfather wished, for she was immensely delighted to take this journey up to the beautiful goat pasture. Heidi was so full of joy that she called out to Peter as soon as he saw him coming down that evening, "Peter, Peter, we're coming up with you tomorrow to stay all day." In reply, Peter growled like an angry bear and struck out furiously at the innocent Distelfink trotting along beside him. But the alert Distelfink had noticed that movement at the right time. He made a high leap right over Schneehefeli, and the blow whizzed in the air. Clara and Heidi went up to their two beautiful beds with great expectations, and they were so full of their plans for the next day that they decided to stay awake all night to talk about them until they could get up again. But scarcely had they lain down on their soft pillows when their talk suddenly ceased, and Clara saw before her in a dream a great big field, which looked as blue as the sky. It was so thickly studded with bright bluebells, and Heidi heard the robber bird up in the air screaming down, "Come! Come! Come!" Well, very early the next morning the uncle came out of the hut and looked round to see what the day was going to be. On the lofty mountain peaks lay a reddish golden light. A cool breeze was beginning to rock the branches of the fir trees to and fro. The sun was coming up. For a while the old man stood earnestly watching how, after the high mountain tops, the green hills began to shine golden, and then the dark shadows gently faded away from the valley, and a rosy light flowed in, and both heights and depths gleamed in the morning gold. The sun was up. Then the uncle brought the wheelchair out of the shop, placed it in front of the hut, ready for the journey, and afterward went in to tell the children how beautiful the morning had dawned, and to bring them out. Just then Peter came climbing up the mountain. His goats did not come so trustfully as usual by his side, and close in front of him and behind up the mountain. They sprang timidly round here and there, for Peter kept striking about him without any occasion, like a madman, and whatever he hit, he hurt. Peter had reached the highest point of anger and bitterness. For weeks he had not had Heidi to himself as usual. When he came up in the morning, the strange child had always been brought out in her chair, and Heidi was busy with her. When he came down at the evening, the wheelchair with its occupant was still standing under the fir trees, and Heidi was busy doing something for her. She had not been up to the pasture all summer long, and now today she was coming, but with the chair and the stranger in it, and would devote herself to her the whole time. Peter saw how it would be, and he had brought his secret anger to the highest point. He noticed the chair standing there so proudly on its wheels, and looked at it as if it were an enemy which had done him all sorts of harm, and today was going to do still more. Peter looked around him. Everything was still. Not a person was to be seen. Then, as if he were crazy, he rushed at the chair, seized it, and pushed it with such force in his anger toward the slope of the mountain that it actually started away, and in a moment had disappeared. Then Peter rushed up the arm as if he had wings, and did not stop until he had reached the great blackberry bush behind which he could hide, for he was not anxious to have the uncle catch sight of him. But he wanted to see what became of the chair, and the bush was favorably situated on the mountain ledge. Partly concealed, Peter could look down the arm, and if the uncle appeared, he could quickly hide himself. This he did. And what a sight met his eyes! His enemy had already gone rushing far below, driven on faster and faster. Then it turned over again and again. Then it bounded up in the air and fell down on the ground again, and went rolling over and over in its destruction. Pieces were flying away from it in every direction, feet, cushions, back, all thrown high in the air. Peter took such furious delight in the sight that he jumped high with both feet together. He laughed aloud. He stamped with joy. He leaped around in circles. He kept coming back to the same spot and looking down the mountain. He burst out into fresh laughter and danced anew for joy. He was completely beside himself with delight at the ruin of his enemy, for he saw good things in prospect for him. Now the strange child would have to go away, for she had no means of moving about. Heidi would be alone again and come up to the pasture with him, and in the morning and at evening she would be there when he came, and everything would be as it was before. But Peter did not consider what it meant when one has begun to do a wicked deed, or what the consequences may be. Heidi came jumping out of the hut and ran to the shop. Her grandfather followed her with Clara in his arms. The shop door stood wide open. Both boards had been taken away, so that it was as light as day in the farthest corner. Heidi looked all about, ran round the corner, and came back with the greatest surprise in her face. Just then the grandfather came along. "What is it? Have you rolled the chair away, Heidi?" he asked. "I've looked for it everywhere, grandfather, and you said it was standing by the shop door," said the child, still looking in every direction. Meanwhile the wind had grown stronger. It rattled around the shop door and suddenly threw it with a crash back against the wall. "Grandfather, the wind has done it," exclaimed Heidi, and her eyes flashed at the suggestion. "Oh, if it has blown the chair down to Derfley, it will be too late before we can get it back, and we can't go at all." "If it has rolled down there, it will never come back, for it is in 100 pieces," said the grandfather, stepping around the corner and looking down the mountain. "It is strange how it happened," he added, as he looked back at the distance, for the chair had to go round the corner of the hut first. "Oh, what a shame! We can't go now, and perhaps never," mourned Clara. "Now I shall have to go home, for I haven't any chair. Oh, what a shame, what a shame!" But Heidi looked quite trustfully up at her grandfather and said, "Surely, grandfather, you can find a way, so that it won't be as Clara thinks, and that she won't have to go home right off." "We will go up to the pasture this time as we intended. Then we will see what will happen next," said the grandfather. And the children shouted for joy. He went back into the hut, brought out a good number of wraps, laid them in the sunniest place near the hut, and set Clara down on them. Then he brought the children their morning milk and led Schwanley and Barely out of the shed. "Why is he so long coming up this morning?" said the uncle to himself, for Peter's whistle had not yet sounded. The grandfather then took Clara up with one arm and the wraps with the other. "There, now. Forward," he said, starting along. "The goats may come with us." This greatly pleased Heidi. With one arm around Schwanley's neck and the other round Barely's neck, Heidi followed after her grandfather. And the goats were so delighted to go again with Heidi that out of pure love for her they almost squeezed her to death between them. When they reached the pasture, all at once they saw the goats standing in groups, peacefully grazing here and there on the slopes, and Peter lying at full length in the midst of them. "Another time I will cure you of passing us by, sleepyhead. What did you mean?" the uncle called out to him. Peter jumped up at the sound of the well-known voice. "Nobody was up," he replied. "Did you see anything of the chair?" asked the uncle again. "Of what?" said Peter crossly in reply. The uncle said nothing more. He spread the shawls out on the sunny slope, placed Clara on them, and asked if she was comfortable. "As comfortable as in my chair," she said, thanking him. "And I am in the most beautiful place. It's so beautiful, Heidi, so beautiful," she exclaimed, looking all about her. The grandfather started to go back. He said they ought to enjoy themselves together now, and when it was time, Heidi must bring out the dinner, which he had left packed in the bag over in the shade. Then Peter would give them as much milk as they wanted to drink. But Heidi must take good care that it came from Schwanley. Toward evening the grandfather would return. Now he wanted above all to go after the chair and see what had become of it. The sky was deep blue, and not a single cloud was to be seen anywhere. The great snow field beyond them sparkled like thousands and thousands of gold and silver stars. The grey rock peaks stood high and steadfast in their places, as they had done for ages, looking down solemnly into the valley below. The great bird rocked himself up in the blue, and the mountain wind passed over the heights and blew cool around the sunny arm. The children were wonderfully happy. Now and then a little goat would come and lie down by them for a while. The affectionate Schneehefli came most frequently and laid her little head against Heidi, and would not have gone away at all if another one of the flock had not driven her off. Thus Clara learned to know the goats so well that she never mistook one for another, for each had quite a different face and manner. They now felt so familiar with Clara that they came quite near and rubbed their heads against her shoulder. This was always a sign of friendship and affection. Several hours had passed in this way when it occurred to Heidi that she would like to go over to the place where there were so many flowers and see if they were all open and as beautiful as they were the year before. When her grandfather came back at evening, they might go there with Clara, but perhaps the flowers would already have their eyes closed then. Heidi's longing kept increasing until she could resist it no longer. So she asked a little timidly, "Would you be angry, Clara, if I should run away very fast and leave you alone? I should so much like to see how the flowers are. But wait," a thought came to Heidi. She jumped aside and pulled up some beautiful bunches of green plants. Schneehefli immediately came running toward her, and she took her round the neck and led her to Clara. "There, you must not be left alone," said Heidi, pushing Schneehefli to a place a little nearer to Clara. This the goat understood very well and lay down. Then Heidi threw the leaves into Clara's lap, and she said, much delighted, that Heidi must go now and take a good look at the flowers. She was perfectly willing to stay alone with the goat. It was something she had never done before. Heidi ran away, and Clara began to hold out one leaf after another for Schneehefli. And the goat was so tame that she nestled up to her new friend and ate the leaves slowly out of her fingers. One could easily see how contented she was, that she dared to lie so quietly and peacefully in this place of refuge, for outside with the flock she always had to endure a great deal of chasing by the big strong goats. How delightful it seemed to Clara to sit in this way, all alone on a mountain, with only a little trusting goat looking up at her so helplessly. A great desire arose in her to become her own master, and be able to help someone else, and not always be obliged to take help from others. And so many thoughts which she had never had before came to Clara, and a strange desire to live on in the beautiful sunshine and to do something to give pleasure to someone, as she was now pleasing Schneehefli. An entirely new joy came into her heart, and it seemed as if everything she knew might be much more beautiful and different from what she had ever seen before, and she felt so contented and happy that she had to throw her arms around the goat's neck and exclaim, "Oh, Schneehefli, how beautiful it is up here! If I only could stay here always with you." Meanwhile, Heidi had reached the place where the flowers were. She screamed with delight. The whole slope lay covered with shining gold. They were the bright rock roses. Thick, deep clusters of bluebells nodded above them, and a strong, spicy odor filled the air about the sunny spots, as if cups of the most precious balsam was poured out up there. All the fragrance, however, came from the little brown blossoms, which stretched up their round heads modestly here and there between the golden flower cups. Heidi stood and looked, and drew long breaths of the sweet air. Suddenly she turned around and came panting with excitement back to Clara. "Oh, you really must come," she called out before she could reach her. "They're so beautiful, and everything is so beautiful, and perhaps by evening it won't be so any longer. Perhaps I can carry you. Don't you think I could?" Clara looked at the excited Heidi in surprise. She shook her head. "No, no. What are you thinking of, Heidi? You're ever so much smaller than I." "Oh, If I could only walk." Then Heidi looked all around her, trying to think of some new plan. Up where he had been lying on the ground, Peter still sat staring at the children. He had been sitting thus for hours, always gazing down as if he could not realize what he saw. He had destroyed the hated chair, that he might make an end of it all, and so that the stranger might not be able to move, and a short time afterwards she appeared up here and was sitting before him on the ground next to Heidi. It could not be possible, and yet it was true, and whenever he chose he could see that it was so.